My name is Miriam Hansen. I'm an artist working from Oslo, and I do installation art. I work a lot with plant material in how I construct work. And it's also been a core interest in my practice for the last 5 or 6 years. And as of now, I'm working on a project that's been spanning over a period of 3 years, dealing with the concept of sleep and its relation to botanical myths. In the work, As You Seldom Spoke, You Were Rarely Wrong, I worked with the Astrup Fearnley Museum in Oslo for a show they did, inviting younger artists to do like their first museum show. I was interested in relating to like the museal aspect with a practice that is otherwise quite ephemeral, in that working with living matter kind of defines like how long you could have an exhibition open. It's also reliant on seasons, for example, and it's not so easily transportable. So I was interested in bringing that into a museum setting. And what I ended up doing for that context was using a starting point of a rare Norwegian, or it's not only Norwegian, but a plant endemic to Norway called henbane. It's mainly known through the mythology of the witch, and also the idea of the witch's travel to Sabbath through an ointment that was supposedly made up of this plant. And it was also at the time restricted to grow. So I was interested in like this idea of shapes the narratives, and who's the ones that writing the history of these practices. I guess my main field has been looking into Northern European history in relation to practices with plants, and then what has been written about those practices has mainly been in via the church, because previous to that most of it was an oral narrative, because the idea of the witch is also a narrative placed on the prosecution of groups and not by the groups themselves. But as of recent years, with henbane and also with its rarity in Norway, it's become quite a thing of celebration almost. And I thought it was an interesting historic fact to kind of play upon this kind of desirability of a once demonized plant. And it's kind of representative of many of my works, as gallery spaces, museums, and places that show art usually aren't really that friendly towards plants, in that you have climate-controlled spaces and it's very dry, and then you introduce something that thrives in humidity, and it might not be the best fit. What I'm interested in with creating those kind of spaces is to also shape how the artwork is being taken care of, in that it's not necessarily a finished piece that can just be placed somewhere and then it's fine, but you have to kind of constantly, you have to take on the role of a caretaker in relationship to it. You have to water it, you have to tend to it, you have to kind of constantly be in contact with it. And I think that it's become a part of how I work, this idea of responsibility in relation to something that is living, and that giving that responsibility to someone else has been something that I have been doing more and more. Right as of now, I'm working on a longer project based upon sleep, or the idea of sleep in connotation to different botanical practices. And so I made a work called And Slumber Will Return, which is a not so clever play on the ASMR. consisting of different tinctures made from different sleep-aiding plants that were dispersed into a gallery space through sculptural material diffusers, you could call them. So the space in itself during the exhibition hours would then be more and more humid and more also saturated with these different botanical substances. And they ranged from things that have a more like somatic claim to relax you to plants like mugwort, for example, that's more or less seen as a guide for aiding lucid dreaming. So it kind of spanned from the kind of like all aspects of the falling asleep. And I think it's interesting when working with a frame of reference that can often be quite esoteric in that you have so many different sources when it comes to plants that can like have potential benefits. Then you have the discussion of kind of like natural medicine and that whole ordeal. And that exhibition was also kind of a play upon the anticipation of what it would feel like and how this kind of context you were presented with that had certain, not claims, but it had certain kind of narratives tied into it and how you would feel or like experience the space as a body just by being inside of it. Which is also something that's been present in other work, but then the human bodies have more or less been also aids to kind of create a nice climate for plant material in being producers of CO2. So you would kind of have a function as a body in that sense, that your presence would also then kind of feed back into having a function for the space. I think like this project with sleep has also expanded a bit for me in being more now about poison plants and that landscape and how it's often described as practices that use poison plants. And this has been something I've been exploring through a work over a few years now with, I think it comes back to like how I research things and also like how certain species of plants correlate so much with, for example, medicinal history. And it's kind of through that I've gained this interest, because it's up until very recently that we utilize dried plant material to make like medicine that would be sold. And I think up until the 70s, you would, for example, prescribe Datura stramonium, like thorn apple for asthma in Norway, which is a very known, very poisonous plant that you're not supposed to inhale. I guess coming back to like why I think this field is interesting is that I think it reminds me somehow of like the function of an artwork is that you give something a value that is kind of defined by you. Like grown up foraging in the woods, and I've always had this kind of relationship to knowing kind of like which plants you could use and that had like a usefulness, which were poisonous and so forth. It became very interesting to me like when I started introducing them into my studio, and they slowly started to kind of fit into other sculptural work that I was making, and all the tradition of keeping indoor plants, for example. The idea of kind of surrounding yourself with something that you could define as nature, but is at the same time also so far removed from anything that could be considered nature, and then you have it in your house. And I find the whole ordeal quite. It's a very strange practice, I think, and I think I also like the kind of communal aspect of it. That even though you have maybe no relationship to being in the forest, everybody has a relationship to plants in one way or another. And I think it opens up to be able to touch upon many things just because of that kind of common ground. I think like plants is a way of kind of talking about something more than human, but in a way that is very like communally engaging somehow. The idea of sleep has, in a way, been like the catalyst for like a series of exhibitions the last years. And in addition to the project with Vapor, I showed 2 dual exhibitions, one in Trondheim under the title It's Just Us, and one this spring at UKS in Oslo, where it was called Furrows, or a stage for nightmares, working with like the potential of the sleep as a kind of as a not so pleasant state through this urban legend of a plant and its ties to dream influence through like giving the person nightmares. But it was more about the potential of kind of influencing your sleep once you've done looking at the exhibition. It was a tiled surface, you were invited to lay down on it and then possibly kind of ruin your sleep, was the gist of it. Like either my practice as being so heavily research-based, even though it's something that I am very personally interested in and something that feeds into a lot of my work, but it's not something that's necessarily presented through the work itself. And I think with more or less like the more sculptural part of the work is also a space for me to also allow myself to have a bit more, immediate reaction to something, or more like a tactility in terms of like relating to another subject through like choice of materials or like how things are presented, and all of those aspects are more or less part of an intuitive process.